Andrew, hello, welcome back, and welcome everyone to another episode of Talk ADHD. You and I have decided to do something that I've not yet seen any other podcast do in so much detail, which is to look at the kinds of numbers and figures that are very often quoted about neurodivergent conditions, whether it's ADHD, autism, anything else, to look at the numbers, to look at the headlines that we're seeing recently, and to really dig into what does this mean? What's the reality? So just to tee this up, we are August 2024, and in the past 3 weeks alone, there has been a major BBC investigation into the amount of people on waiting lists, NHS waiting lists for ADHD assessments. We have still got regular conversations about ADHD medication shortages, which are now being taken a step further by a report that was published, I think, in the Financial Times only this week about the amount of women who are now accessing and taking ADHD meds and what that means and why they've, quote unquote, decided they needed to do that. We had an ITV investigation a couple of weeks ago, which looked at the amount of children and parents who are desperate for SEND provision in schools and the percentages of children that meant in the UK who needed help. And what we're really getting to is the wider population, people for whom this isn't they don't live with these conditions, are hearing lots of numbers. And I think it's causing an awful lot of confusion and in some quarters, almost a lot of fear. And from my point of view, as somebody talking to organisations professionally about this, it tends to lead to a question I hear a lot, which I'm sure we will come back to, which is, it seems like everyone's got, it feels like everyone is neurodivergent. And as somebody actually said to me in a training course recently, don't we just think that we can't now say everyone's a little bit ADHD or autistic because it looks like everyone is? Now, I firmly disagree with that, but I can understand why they're getting to that point, given what they're seeing in the conversations, because at no point has this topic of neurodiversity, being neurodivergent, had so much mainstream media coverage. So I think it's important to start maybe with the top line, which is the number most people see when they first look at this is, depending on where you look, somewhere between 15 and 20% of the UK population or the global population are assumed to have at least one neurodivergent condition. We see that a lot. I am guilty of questioning that. I am guilty of thinking, how does that include everyone who doesn't know yet? Because my assumption was that figure, let's call it that, was produced by waiting lists, what we knew of waiting lists, by reported data of people going to their doctor for appointments, etc. So the question I always asked, and I think it's a good place to start, is how does that figure get arrived at, and can it really include everyone? So, for example, can it include genetically inherited conditions where, let's say, a child has been diagnosed and the parent hasn't got there yet and realised it may be them as well? Does it include people who may never have realised that they were neurodivergent and maybe wandering around perfectly happily with ADHD or autism and just don't know? Let's start there. And I know you're going to say big question, so I'm going to try and dial it down. We get told this figure. You've used the term before that we've used on the podcast of, and I'm going to get this right, epidemiological statistics and numbering. Now, first things first, you told me that because you did your master's on this. Just to put this out there, this is your thing, right? Understanding these numbers. So this isn't supposition. You're able to do the maths. But what does that mean in terms of how do we get to those numbers?
Okay, so those numbers don't come from counting up how many people are on the waiting list. That's not how it's done at all. In the same way that we don't know how many households watched Ant and Dec on Saturday night because someone looked through everybody's living room window and checked whether they were watching BBC One or ITV. So we take a sample and project that out. So it has to be a reasonable size sample. So imagine standing in the high street and interviewing 100 people and assessing 100 people for ADHD. The likelihood is that you'd find somewhere between 2 and 5 people with ADHD when you've got through that 100. Yeah?
Right.
And that's how it's done. So it's an approximation, just like television viewing figures are an approximation. I think we're used to, with the pandemic, we got used to Chris Whitty with absolute numbers and reporting on absolutes because we had to have that level of information to manage the pandemic. But in terms of broader epidemiological data, it's usually an approximation based on a small sample. So it isn't a definite. But that means that that's how we capture the people who haven't even recognised ADHD in themselves yet.
Okay, run that by me. How would we capture them if they did? So if you stop 100 people on the high street, if they don't know, they're going to say no.
So no, I'm not. And this is where the subtlety comes in, Matt. Well, I'm not saying stop 100 people on the high street and say, "Do you have ADHD?" I'm saying stop 100 people on their high street and assess them for ADHD.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
So
that's a completely different question, then, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's subtleties like that in data can really throw your understanding off, because if you're not understanding which question is being asked, then the answer might not be the answer to the question that you're thinking it is. Yeah. So even with this one figure that we're talking about, this prevalence of ADHD in the population, some people, as you say, are thinking, oh, that's counting how many people are taking medication or on a waiting list or whatever, and that's not how it's done. Often questions are asked and then the information is presented in answer to a different question.
It is. And do you think, therefore, that's where this information can start to almost become a bit like sort of a game of whispers being, channeled down different people, and we start with somebody who knows and has a figure, and then that gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and it gets repeated but with an inaccuracy or with somebody's own interpretation, and suddenly we get to people presenting figures as absolutes when actually that's not quite right.
Yeah, and we see that a lot because we want that, once again, we want that quick answer, that comfortable, well, that's the figure. And I've been guilty of it. I've misquoted statistics and then realised when I sort of questioned it, and that's very much what this episode's about, is questioning these numbers that have been thrown around lately. It's not until I've taken a step back and used my own critical approach to the data that I've realised, I've joined in with the headlines when actually there's a lot behind the headlines, as there always is.
Yeah, there is. Okay, now I know that what you've really kindly done is you've actually put a lot of work into this. You've got a series of slides that we're going to talk through in sort of summary as we go through this that touch on a number of these figures. We'll include them as a PDF, which is really good of you for other people to read and make sense of. What I think is worth doing is saying they touch upon all the things I mentioned in the introductions. They touch upon the BBC figure of, the BBC said it was an 8-year wait list for ADHD. It touches on this conversation that's now happening about medication access and how many people are taking medication, and it touches on that figure, that 20% figure. So people can go and look at those. Let's maybe start with the BBC 2 weeks ago put out a big sort of day of coverage, which essentially seemed to say that from research they had commissioned, they'd arrived at this figure of X hundreds of thousands of people on an NHS waiting list. It was only adults on the waiting list they were talking about. And they arrived at this figure of 8 years wait list as the average. Now, before we go any further, if it was an 8-year wait list as average, that's awful. That's a terrible state of affairs. And this podcast is not going to go into politics or reasons or anything. This is to look at the numbers, to look at what was presented in the news and to use your expertise to understand. I will, if it's okay with you, share the slides as we talk through this so that people can see what we're talking about if they watch. So what we've got on screen now is the start. Now, the figures that I see there are 21,011 people were seen in 2023.
Yeah.
We've got 17,000. Is that right? 17,000?
177,000.
177,000, sorry, dyslexia. 177,404 people on waiting lists. Okay.
Yeah.
So you've done a calculation there, which I think is what the BBC did, which was 777,000 divided. Is that right?
Exactly. And that comes out at 8.4 years. So that is adding up all the people that were seen in 2023 and using that to divide the number of people on a waiting list, which works out how many years. Because if you saw 21,000 in 2023 and you carry on at that rate, it'll take 8.4 years to see the other 177,404. Does that make sense?
So, perfect sense. So, taking that a step forward to the slide I'm showing on screen, which is slightly different, what the report said was their figures came from the healthcare trusts that gave them the data. They didn't have data, as far as I understood, from every single healthcare trust in the UK, which is fine. It was a freedom of information request, I believe.
I think it was about 2/3 of people responded.
Right, okay. So there's some missing here. Now, what we've got on screen then is a slightly different presentation of this. So we've got the same numbers, the same pie chart that we saw before. And then do you want to talk me through what you've got in the headlines?
Yeah. So this is sort of where my head went with this data, because I thought, hang on a minute, 8 years, that doesn't account for lots of maths here. That's a very sort of back of a fag packet type calculation, and very rough and ready. Let's add up all the number of people waiting, divide it by the number of people seen in 2023. But look at the range of numbers of assessments seen in different areas. Lots of areas are doing much better than others. Yeah. So if we just add up the totals and use those to divide, we lose some sensitivity in the answer. So what I did was I took out the outlier of Sheffield, because no one's going to wait 2,245 years to be seen. And that is a bit of an outlier because only 3 people were seen from a 6,700 people waiting list. And that's clearly something about how the service is operating. And I wonder who those 3 people were and how they got seen, because it probably wasn't through a standard referral to an adult ADHD service. I would imagine. I don't know Sheffield services at all, for adults anyway. So I took those out, because that would really skew your average wait, wouldn't it, if you were one of your figures was 2,200 years. But what I did was I worked out how many years it would take to clear each waiting list first. We aren't into, as far as I know, busing people from Sheffield to Kent. So when Kent, who are doing really, really well on the, they come out high on the number of people that are getting seen. They've seen 1,272. Surrey are doing well as well, 1,896. So they're going to clear their list more quickly. North East London are going to be the quickest. They've got a waiting list of 548 and they do 790 a year. So it's not going to take them much time at all. So once that waiting list is cleared, so long as no one else is referred, we could bus people in from Sheffield who are not going to wait 2,000 years for their assessment to North East London or Surrey or Kent. But that isn't going to happen, Matt. So this 8-year waiting list is a fictional number based on busing people around the country to areas where services are more efficient. What you need to do is work out how many years it takes to clear each waiting list locally and then create the average. If you do that, the figure's 13 years, not 8 years. And that is that again is excluding Sheffield because it's such an outlier. So that average wait is then 13 years. If you remove the top 10 performers, so the people who are getting through their lists most quickly, it's a 15-year wait. So I was a bit frustrated by this grab at 8 years because it misrepresents things, because the 8-year wait assumes that people in Gloucestershire and Leeds and Greater Manchester down the bottom of that list are going to be bussed to North East London and Kent because they've cleared their waiting list. And it also doesn't acknowledge that anybody else is going to join that waiting list anywhere in the country. No. So, the wait list, the wait is for the people who've been seen this week. They have waited 13 years on average in this country, statistically speaking, and this is what you can do with statistics, So someone joining the wait list today will wait 13 years. Possibly longer, depending on how many other people are referred in. And as the intensity of referrals goes up, that wait list just grows and grows and grows. So, no, it's not 8 years.
I mean, there's a part of me that wanted you to come out and say, no, it's not 8 years, it'll be 4 years. But there you go. The truth is that it's far worse than the headline figure. Now, again, this is not to talk about the why, right? This isn't to talk about the why. The one thing I will just touch on is this, again, is why I think it's so important that if you think it's ADHD. And you can't access right to choose, which isn't included in these. And you can't access a private diagnosis or assessment, which isn't included in these figures. Finding your tribe and trying to learn from credible sources as early as you can, and trying to learn things that may help you, excluding medication because you can't access it, is really important. It's really important because that may be the difference between you feeling that you start to understand yourself and cope a bit better, while you sit on a waiting list. The other side to this, though, is, as you said, that's about 2/3 of the respondees to that. So we don't know what those figures would be like with all healthcare trusts included. Could be higher, conceivably could be a little bit lower, but if it's between 8 and 15 years, that's an insane amount of time, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's statistically, it's a huge amount of time. Okay, so let's move on then, because then that feeds into this. You look at that, or rather, I hear that and go, well, all right, let's say 15 years. There's a 15-year wait list. This is just ADHD, and there's nuance to me saying just, which is comorbidity, but just ADHD. So I now circle back to this thing of 20% of the population, 15% of the population are neurodivergent. Now, on the same day the BBC released their report, ITV released a report which was about children and parents desperate for SEND provision in the UK. And I saw a post from a very sort of prominent brand within this space online. And they quoted some figures. So they said, 20% think differently, which is an interesting way of phrasing it. Potentially neurodivergent. Okay. But then there were some figures quoted. I know you and I discussed these. So the figures that were quoted are on screen now. I'm just going to read into them. What it said was, if 1 in 10 people are known to have dyslexia, 1 in 10 people known to have dyspraxia, 1 in 10 known to have dyscalculia, 1 in 20 ADHD, and 1 in 67 are autistic, that is 20% of the general population. Now, on the surface, and I'm not a mathematician, at a glance you go, okay, I can see that, but you've done some more thinking about this. So talk me through where you've come to on that calculation.
Okay, so it's really interesting hearing you describe that and sort of set the scene for this slide, because that leading light nationally isn't saying 20% of humankind think differently. They say if 20% of humankind think differently. The quote on that slide is taken from a social media post by a member of their team. So that person has said that is 20% of the population. And if you do the maths, which is simply that what's up there on the screen, that works out at 5.85%. So you have to imagine sort of if you imagine a room full of an empty room, like a dance hall, and 10 people walk in, one of those has dyslexia, and the other 9 neurotypical, and then another 10 people come in, and one of those has dyscalculia, and he goes over to see his dyslexic friend, and the other 9 go and see their 9 neurotypical friends. And then 20 people come in, and one of those has ADHD. So there are 3 people in one corner being neurodivergent, 36 people in the other corner of the room. And then you bring the autistic person in with his 66 friends, and the dyspraxic person in with his 9 friends. So you've got 5 neurodivergent diagnoses in a room full of 117 people. And that is 5.85%. But that doesn't account for coexisting conditions. So how do we know that that person who came in with 66 neurotypicals that was autistic didn't also have ADHD? So this headline, 20% of people think differently, I think it's the idea is to cement, hey, these things are more common than you think. As if we need it to be more common. And I know in conversations we've had, Matt, you've seemed sometimes to feel like a need for there to be a greater prevalence than there actually is. We've got a leading light saying if 20% of humankind think differently. I'd actually say the number's a lot higher. You only have to look at the recent election to know that people think differently. Yeah? So you've got to see behind the headlines. This isn't a leading charity saying 20% of humankind are neurodivergent. It's wordplay. But it's so comfortable for us to just say, oh, that means 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent because they say so. What's that about? When the figures, and you've got one of the leading lights in that leading light saying that is 20% of the population when the math says, no, it's not, it's 5.85%. What's that all about? You've got to ask that question. And then of that 5.85%, how many of those have comorbid conditions?
The next slide then, which is, you're talking about comorbid, and I think this is the most important thing that I'm guilty of not really joining dots on for a while, is that it's this very linear, one person with. Well, I only have to look at me or my sons to realise that makes absolutely no sense to do the maths that way, because here am I with a handful of different diagnoses, and some of my sons and my wife. You're right, in that dance hall scenario, it doesn't make sense to say that 1 in 10 or 1 in 67. So you've got some other figures here, so NHS and British Dyslexia Association prevalence data.
Yeah, so
and this is really interesting, and I think it's interesting because...
Hi folks, it's Matt. Sorry to butt in, but I'll be really quick. It would really help us if you could take a minute to do a few things to help this podcast reach more people. Wherever you're listening, if you could like it, assuming that you do, if you could subscribe wherever you're choosing to listen to this or watch it, and if you could jump onto the YouTube link and leave a comment about the episode that you've just listened to, Andrew and I would really appreciate it, because that all really helps this podcast reach more people. For now, I'll stop waffling on and we'll get back to...
I'm looking at it, and the difference between children and adults is kind of interesting. But I think what's really interesting is these numbers aren't small.
Not small, but they're not huge either. There's a lot on this set of slides in relation to this if 20% of humankind think differently, because that 20% of humankind didn't take into account Tourette's syndrome. It didn't take into account speech and language disorders, intellectual disability. So it missed out some of the neurodivergent community as considered by the NHS.
Yeah.
So this data is drawn from several NHS reports on neurodivergence in England. So there is all of this sort of coexisting diagnostic formulation going on. There are people being excluded from headlines, and it's a lot more murky and muddled, because 100% of humankind think differently. We are different.
Yeah, I think it's that thing of what does that actually mean, and what's the point of that statement, isn't it?
Exactly. And why do we need to put that figure on it? So the Office of National Statistics put a figure of 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent, which comes in at just under 15%. And that post that I was talking about that said, hey, no, it's 20% and here's why, when it was 5.85%, was in response to that report that said 15% of children have special educational needs. And it was, hey, no, it's 20%. Well, no, it's not. It's a lot more complicated than that. And we don't need it to be 20% to have a valid argument.
No, and I think that's important. There's this almost social media-esque desire for hyperbolic facts and figures and headlines, because the more eye-catching, the more it proves a point. But actually, that's not right, because that 5 point whatever people, 5.85, are just as important as if it's 25.5 or 55.5. It doesn't make a difference that it's bigger. It makes a difference that we're here.
That's right.
Sure.
That's exactly it.
Okay, so let's take this a step on then. So there's another slide here, which again is really interesting. So we've got comorbidity with different disorders. So we've got comorbidity with Tourette, speech and language, intellectual disabilities, DCD, dyslexia. So I presume we're still talking dyslexia here, yes?
So this is still coexisting conditions, but this is looking at which conditions coexist with ADHD in orange and ASD in blue, and it just reinforces the point of the last slide, really, that I said if that one person with ADHD walked into the room, there's actually a 3 in 10 chance that they also are autistic, and of the autistic person that comes in, there's also a 3 in 10 chance that they have ADHD. So it gets really complicated, and the prevalence, therefore, is probably reduced by that coexisting data. I'm not aware of any papers that have sort of drilled it down and done the calculations, because people like the headline numbers. But the information is there. If you think critically about the information that's presented to you, and you can see beyond the 20% and see that it's 5.85%, but actually that disregards Tourette's and speech and language disorders and other conditions, it's a lot more subtle than that, and it's risky, I think, to be saying 1 in 5, but it's such a catchy number. It's a seductive number to say it's 1 in 5.
Yeah, it's memorable.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take this on then. So the next conversation that's come out this week is about the use of ADHD medication going up.
Yeah.
There's a report specifically focusing on women. And again, you read the headline and it's presented as if this is only talking about adult females, adult women who are accessing ADHD meds, right? And how the report talks about how they're finding about their ADHD through social media influencers and then going to seek diagnosis. And that's a conversation for another time, and interestingly, one we've got teed up. So you've got some numbers here about use of ADHD meds in 2023. And I'm looking at this by age group, first of all, and there's a bit of a headline in that the 65 and over aren't accessing it at all. But can you explain the chart for me? So we've got a total population in thousands, those treated in thousands, total of the population treated, a prevalence number. But then it's the three at the bottom of this chart that are interesting. So you've got a percentage of the age untreated with ADHD. That number presented as thousands. And then the figures where you say we're reaching. So can you explain that? If you start with maybe the 5 to 19-year-old, and then we'll...
Okay, so yeah, this came about. I did these calculations about 4 years ago, looking at the 2019 data. And this is one area of data where the UK does reasonably well. So we track all of the prescriptions that are written. So we know what's being prescribed. The NHS needs to know what it's spending on medicines. But you can drill that right down to GP surgeries, and you can get data on sort of gender and all, which is what was done for the report. Wasn't it 18% more women are taking ADHD meds? Yeah. That's an interesting spin there, which I'll come back to, but I'll talk you through what these calculations are about. So for the 2023 calculations, I was a bit lazy and just rounded to the nearest 1,000, where in the 2019 ones, which I'll put on the handout, I was a little bit more precise. So we look at the total population on that first row, that 14,000 5 to 19-year-olds. That's how many 5 to 19-year-olds there are in England.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and 150,000 of those 14 million, all the numbers are in thousands. So 150,000 of those 5 to 19-year-olds are taking medication for ADHD or have had a prescription issued in 2023 for an ADHD medicine. So that is just over 1% of the population of 5 to 19-year-olds was prescribed a medicine for ADHD in 2023. If the prevalence of the population that has ADHD in 5 to 19-year-olds is 2%, then we're reaching 54% of those children with medicines. If it's at the higher end of the prevalence data, which say 5%, we're only reaching 21% of those 5 to 19-year-olds by giving 150,000 young people ADHD treatment in 2023.
And why would that B, just to help me understand that. So, in the difference in prevalence, why the supposition between if it's 2%, if it's 5%?
So that's about that high street assessment. That interview
Okay.
100 people and find out how many have ADHD. It's possible that you might be slightly skewed. So usually prevalence data is given in a range, and that's why I've presented this data as a range rather than it's absolutely 3% of children have ADHD. We can't say that, but what we can say is, look, if it is 2% of children, then we're reaching 54%. If it's 5% of children, then we're only reaching just over 1 in 5. And what stands out to me there is that the majority of prescriptions being issued are for that age group. So whilst the news headlines are saying there's an 18% hike in women taking ADHD medicines, actually there's more children taking ADHD medicines. And the increase, so it's not on the screen, but that 54% figure was 41% in 2019, and that 21% figure was 17%. So there has been an increase across the board in people accessing medicines. Most notable in the over 65 group. For all, it's somewhere between 3 and 4% of over 65s with ADHD are treated. That in 2019 was 0.07 to 0.09%. So not even 1/10% of over 65-year-olds in 2019 were being treated. Obviously, in the last few years, some of the under 65s, the older diagnosed people who started treatment, have aged and become over 65, and I think that's why we're seeing more over 65s. For all, it's a drop in the ocean, are treated for ADHD.
So let's go back to that headline then. 18% of women are suddenly, this is how it was presented, because of social media, taking ADHD meds. Looking at those figures, and I think I can see where you're coming from here, would it not make more sense to say that there's been an increase in girls, so under adult age, taking ADHD or accessing ADHD medication? I'm not saying there haven't been more adults diagnosed. That's not what I'm saying, but I think those figures are maybe, like you said, it's that nuanced word, isn't it? Where's the balance between adults and children?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's around about 500,000 more people in the adult age range are diagnosed and treated for ADHD in 23 than in 2019. It's about 500,000 more.
Now, I can see how that makes sense, because it's something I say often, and it's been borne out in the waiting lists and all of the other statistics we are seeing, rightly or wrongly, is since COVID, which, let's be fair, since 2019, 2020, post-COVID, there has been an explosion of knowledge and awareness and questioning, and people sat at home for 4 years going, oh, is that why? So it does make sense that there are incremental increases in everything. That doesn't mean everyone has got ADHD. To go back to that comment at the start, that doesn't mean everyone's a little bit ADHD. It doesn't mean 68 point whatever it is million people are probably ADHD somewhere. That is not what's been said. But what's been said is, when more people start to realise it might be them, and are fortunate enough, and that's the real world, go back to the rating list, are fortunate enough to have been seen, diagnosed, and prescribed, yes, those numbers will increase.
We would hope so. We would hope so. Yeah, that's the whole idea. And I think it's about thinking critically. When you see that 18% more women, you need to look at what that means. That means that where there were 100 women, now there's 118. But if there was only one, then there would be 1.18 women.
Yeah.
So it's always relative to where it came from. It's not just.
But again, it's seductive.
21 in 5 women are now taking ADHD drugs, but that's what happens with statistics. People go, oh, 18%. That's like 1 in 5 women. What's going on? This is daft. And it's not 1 in 5 women. It's an 18% increase. Where there were 5, there's now 6.
Yeah, from the baseline. So I've just thrown up some other figures you've got on screen then. So you've got here in our presentation that says untreated, diagnosed and undiagnosed 757, waiting list 177. with an interesting little side note of some of these may not have ADHD. Treated with meds, 150, and then a total. So talk me through that then.
Okay, so this is trying to pull all of these numbers together. So the 177,000 on a waiting list, that comes from the BBC. That's those people that are getting on the bus from Sheffield to Kent. The 115,000 is coming from the prescribing data, and the 1 million is the number of people with ADHD in the country. Therefore, there's about 750,000 people in the UK, well, in England, with undiagnosed, untreated ADHD. So some people will have a diagnosis, have tried treatment, and no longer be taking medicines. Yeah, so we can't count them in the 115,000, and they're not on the waiting list. They've got a diagnosis, they tried meds, and it wasn't for them. But we can't ignore those people, so I had to add them in somewhere. So they have to go into the 250,000 people who are not accessing medicines, which, that's not the same as not treated, because there are other ways of coping with ADHD than taking medications, yeah? We very much advocate for those as well. But it's difficult to tease out those people who've made that choice not to take medication from those people who aren't yet even aware that they might have ADHD. And when you look at these, go on, Matt.
I was going to just throw this in there. Are the figures going to change because of what's happened since October last year with meds being in shorter supply? Will that skew things, I imagine?
Potentially. I mean, these figures go to April this year, the prescribing data. It's 23 to 24. So that 115,000 adults taking medication. And these numbers that are on screen now are all adults. This doesn't count for the children. So the point here is that for all these headline grabbing statistics, there's a lot more people out there that just aren't even aware that they're struggling. And I think that's the real issue here. And they are in that somewhere between 3 and 4%. It doesn't need to be 20% for 750,000 people not to be accessing support. We don't need it to be dramatic in 5 figures. There's 750,000 people who statistically could benefit from some form of support or treatment for their ADHD. The calculations I've done say there's more adults waiting for assessment than there's adults taking treatment for ADHD. So for every person who has taken a dose of ADHD medication today, there's someone else in this country sitting on a waiting list. So when you say 18% more women are taking ADHD treatment, each one of those also has another person with them, a counterpart, sitting on a waiting list. Only 1 in 10 adults with ADHD are taking medication for their ADHD in England. If that was diabetes, if that was even depression, I think we'd be horrified. We've got 72% of the population projected of adults with ADHD don't take medication for ADHD. And that's not the people who are diagnosed, that's the whole population. So some of those people have a diagnosis and choose not to take it, even though they know they have ADHD. But the majority are people who haven't even considered it yet. 17% of people with ADHD are on a waiting list. So there are even more out there than are on the waiting list. That horror story of a 13, 15-year wait is very much the tip of the iceberg.
Here is where my head goes, having listened to that and looked at all those things. I think this is, in some ways, really positive that the conversation is happening, right? That there's more conversation about those people who may or may not have ADHD. And that's all good. We can't get away from the fact that media in all its forms is based on standout headlines, hyperbole, drama, exaggeration, and rarely is it seeking to be accurate. Rarely is it seeking to tell the full story. Right? That I think anyone would agree on. But I think where we're at, for me, certainly in what I do for a living, talking to organisations and mentoring people, is it's really, really confusing. It can be really confusing to know what's right, what's accurate, what to believe, what credible sources are giving credible information, and more importantly, certain sources are sharing certain information. And I see a lot online where I think, what's the agenda? What's the agenda of that source? Whether it be an organisation, charity, an individual. Why are you saying that? What's the point? Some are for, some are against, some are trying to change conversations to suit their own missions, etc. Whereas I think you and I have always come at it from a very similar point, which is the beauty of sharing as much as is possible, facts, evidence, being brave enough, like you have, to look at data and say, well, actually, if you do the calculations, it's that. The importance of that is, hopefully, if more people can see, they start to understand the reality. And the reality doesn't diminish how difficult it is if you sat on a waiting list. The reality doesn't take away from how difficult it is if you can't even get on a waiting list or get an assessment or get a diagnosis or access medication. But what being realistic, what being sort of very fact-based does do, I think, is it makes it easier to advocate for oneself and to say, I'm part of this. I'm part of this number. I feel part of this number. And therefore, I will make noise with the people I need to make noise with to get the support I need. And that's what's important for me. That's why I think this is such an important conversation to have had. Yes, it's a very statistical podcast. There aren't many like it, right? There aren't. I had a comment from somebody online the other day saying, oh, it's too sciencey and it's too statistical. You know what? Yes, it is. But today has been deliberately leaning on that because this needs to be shown. We need to have someone saying, look, this is what the math says. This is what statistics says. This is how we get to figures.
Yeah, for me, the start point for wanting to do this podcast, which is a little bit different than other things we've done, was that 8-year waiting list figure. Because that is a correct calculation. It is absolutely, on average, an 8.4-year wait. And the BBC have done a great job in gathering up that data and doing all that freedom of information requests. It takes a long time to do that. I'm not wanting to downplay anyone's attempts at representing data, and that 8.4-year number is correct. But that 8.4-year number, and what really got me going about that, was thinking of all those people for over 5 years being bused from Sheffield to Kent, which the majority of people wouldn't have thought of.
No.
And it's so easy to go, 8 years is awful. And it is. But it's only 8 years if we've got people being bused all around the country and no more people being added to the waiting list. So I wanted to do this podcast to say, always think behind the figures, always think that next layer behind it, because there is lots of work being done to raise awareness, and that's great, and I don't want to put down anyone's attempts to raise awareness. It's making a difference. People do think differently, and we do need to be having that conversation. My point here hasn't been about criticizing other people's maths. It's been about just highlighting that if you take a step to one side and look at the data, you will see different things. And people may sort of want to go and analyze my data and may find mistakes in my calculations. And I'll say, yep, okay, I made a mistake there. But I have checked and triple checked them, particularly the 2019 ones, because I had to, because it was for a pharmaceutical company that I prepared that data. And then that calculation has just been sort of moved over with the new data from the NHS Business Services Authority for the prescribing for people with ADHD in 2023. I just wanted to highlight how easy it is to be seduced, and I too have been seduced by these, the 1 in 5 figure.
Yeah.
When the Office of National Statistics say it's 1 in 7. Right? There's a difference there. What's that about? Who's counting differently and why? Why does the Office of National Statistics, who have access to all the public service data, say it's different than another significant organisation in this space? I'm not saying who's right. I'm just saying the data's different.
Yeah. On which note, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Folks, I will say this again, please do consider whether you leave a comment or you subscribe to the YouTube channel. It does help. Algorithms are funny beasts, and the more you take 2 minutes to click a couple of icons, ring notification bells and subscribe, the more other people stand a chance of seeing this information. You can always share this podcast to whoever you want, however you want. And that's the only aim for Andrew and I. It's not about fame, fortune and everything that goes with it. It's about trying to help more people understand what it means to be a person with and everything that involves. So we really do appreciate it if you do do those things and can take the time to do those. But for now, that was the numbers as we've presented them, and I hope it's helped. And we will see you all for another episode of Talk ADHD next week.